Memories, I always thought fear was a dark alley at midnight, a shadow flickering in the corner of my room, or a sudden noise that made me glance back with a racing heart, my pulse pounding like a frantic drum. But real terror, it's the gut-wrenching, soul-shaking realization that you're no longer the master of your own body, that something else, something not of this world, has taken over, leaving you a prisoner in your own skin, helpless and unseen, trapped in a nightmare from which there's no waking. It began when my friends, Dan, Jake, and I, escaped the city's relentless noise for a weekend in the rugged mountains of northern Washington. We craved the wild, the untouched beauty of nature, so we packed our tents, grabbed supplies, and headed out, laughing about roasting marshmallows and swapping ghost stories under a sky full of twinkling stars. That first night, as the campfire burned low, its embers casting eerie, dancing shadows on the towering pine trees, we noticed something strange. A massive, silent object hovered above the forest, its dark surface blending with the night sky, faint lights pulsing from its underside, casting a ghostly glow that made the treetops shimmer faintly. The air grew thick, charged with a low electric hum that vibrated deep in my chest, sending a shiver down my spine that lingered like a cold touch. "Do you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaky as he pointed upward, his hand trembling in the firelight, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and dread. I nodded, my throat dry, my pulse quickening, unable to tear my eyes from the unnatural sight. Suddenly, thin beams of light shot down from the object, piercing the ground just a few yards from our campsite. The beams were blinding, their edges shimmering with an otherworldly intensity, and for a moment I thought I saw tall, indistinct shapes moving within them, their forms blurry yet menacing. The wind dropped to a dead stillness. The crickets ceased their song, and the forest fell into an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears like a heavy weight. "Run!" Dan shouted, his voice cracking with raw panic as he snatched his backpack and bolted. We turned and sprinted into the trees, branches snapping under our feet, thorns tearing at our clothes, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, but it was too late. A searing pain exploded in my head, like 1,000 needles piercing my brain. My vision blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors, and my legs gave out. I collapsed, feeling my body slip away, no longer mine to command, as darkness closed in like a suffocating shroud. I woke in a strange place. The walls were smooth metal, cold to the touch, bathed in a dim, bluish light that pulsed faintly. The air was dry, stinging my lungs with an ozone-like scent that hinted at something unnatural. I couldn't move. My limbs felt bound by invisible chains, a crushing weight on my chest, my muscles straining against an unseen force. Panic surged as I thrashed mentally, my heart pounding, but my body remained still, a lifeless shell. Then they appeared, tall, gaunt figures with grey skin and enormous black eyes, voids without pupils, staring at me with an unblinking intensity. Their voices echoed in my mind, cold and mechanical. Human. We study, we adapt. I wanted to scream, to beg, but my throat was locked tight. One of them stepped closer, its long fingers reaching out, their tips glinting faintly in the light. When it touched my forehead, an icy burn seared my skin, sending a shockwave of pain through my nerves, my vision swimming with stars. The room spun, my consciousness plunged into a void, and when I resurfaced, I was back in the forest. But something was wrong. The colors were muted, like frosted glass, and sounds came muffled, as if heard underwater. Jake was shaking Dan, his face pale with terror. "He's not moving," he cried, his voice breaking with desperation. I tried to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. I glanced down and froze. My body lay on the ground, eyes wide open, staring blankly. Was I dead? No. I could feel the chill, I could think, but I wasn't where I belonged. Dread washed over me as I realized I was trapped, a helpless observer in my own mind, disconnected from my flesh. Dan stirred. His movements were jerky, like a puppet, his limbs twitching oddly. He lifted his head, and his eyes, once warm, now held something alien, cold and unfeeling. Jake stumbled back. "Dan?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dan tilted his head, then smiled, a grotesque grin that wasn't human. "We adapt," he he said, his voice distorted, layered with an otherworldly tone. The truth hit me hard. I wasn't in my body anymore. Something else was. I watched, powerless, as my double stood, testing its limbs, and led Jake into the forest, their figures fading into the night. I knew then, no one would ever know the real horror. I'd be lost forever, a forgotten echo in the void.